Maria Castillo was just a janitor, invisible to the powerful lawyers who walked past her every day, until the day she walked into court, not to clean, but to fight for her home. Facing eviction, mocked by a condescending judge, and up against a ruthless attorney who thinks he's already won. Maria has no lawyer, no allies, and no way out except for one secret. She's not just a janitor, she's a brilliant lawyer in disguise, and today she's about to turn the entire courtroom upside down. The judge, the prosecution, the entire system, they think she's powerless. They have no idea who they're dealing with. Before we dive in, buckle up, get ready, and hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have a special surprise you won't want to miss. Maria Castillo's fingers tightened around the mop handle as she pushed it across the cold marble floors of the courthouse. The same floors where powerful attorneys and judges walked without noticing her. She had spent years here, unseen, blending into the background, wiping away the dust of the powerful. Tonight was no different. She wrung out the mop and leaned against the janitor's cart, exhaustion settling into her bones. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She had pulled extra shifts all month trying to keep up with bills, desperate to hold on to the only thing she had left, her father's house. It was small, run down in places, but it was home, the last piece of him she had. She checked her watch. Almost midnight. Time to go home. Maria stepped out into the chilly night air and walked the few blocks back to her house. But as she approached her front door, she froze. A bright orange eviction notice was taped to the peeling wood. Her stomach dropped. Hands trembling, she ripped it down and scanned the words. Final notice. Property foreclosure complete. Vacate. Immediately. Her breath hitched. This had to be a mistake. She had been paying her bills. She wasn't behind. There was no way the bank had the right to take her home. Maria stormed inside, flipping through old documents, receipts, anything that could prove this wasn't real. Her mortgage payments were up to date. She had paperwork to prove it. This wasn't just some bureaucratic oversight. Someone had done this on purpose. A sharp knock at the door made her jolt. She rushed to open it, and there, standing on her porch, was Richard Holloway, the man who had been trying to buy her property for months. Next to him stood Daniel Briggs, a slick, expensive-suited attorney with a smirk that made Maria's skin crawl. Maria, Holloway said, voice dripping with fake sympathy. Hate to say it, but it looks like your house isn't yours anymore. Maria tightened her grip on the doorframe. I've been paying my mortgage. You have no right. Briggs held up a thick legal document, waving it in her face. Actually, we do. According to these records, the property has been foreclosed due to non-payment. Maria's nails dug into her palm. Lies. I want to see the documents, she snapped. Briggs grinned. You'll have your chance. In court. A rush of cold fury surged through Maria. They thought she would just roll over, pack up and leave. They thought she was too powerless to fight back. Fine. They wanted a fight. They were about to get one. Maria sat on her couch, the eviction notice clenched in her hands, her mind racing. She had proof that her mortgage was paid, yet here she was, being told to leave the only home she had ever known. She needed answers. She needed help, but hiring a lawyer was out of the question. She was alone in this fight. The next morning she marched straight to the bank, slamming the eviction notice on the counter in front of a tired-looking clerk. This is a mistake, she said firmly. My payments are up to date. The clerk barely glanced at her before typing lazily into the system. Looks like your home was foreclosed last month. Maria's heart pounded. That's impossible. I have receipts. I made every payment. The clerk sighed as if dealing with her was an inconvenience. I don't know what to tell you, ma'am. It's out of our hands now. The property has already been transferred. Transferred? Her stomach dropped. To who? The clerk hesitated, then lowered his voice. Holloway Holdings, Maria's. Hands clenched into fists. Richard Holloway, the same man who had stood on her porch the night before with that smug, predatory grin. He had been after her home for months, pressuring her to sell. When she refused, he had found another way to take it, legally, or so he thought. Maria turned and stormed out of the bank. If she couldn't get help there, she had only one other option: the courthouse. By the time she arrived, she was already fuming, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't just another angry, desperate homeowner. She knew the law. She knew how the system worked. She just had to find the right person and requested to see the case file on her foreclosure. The woman behind the desk gave her a bored look before handing over a stack of papers. Maria flipped through them quickly, her eyes scanning for something, anything that didn't add up. And then she found it, a signature on the foreclosure approval that wasn't hers, a payment history that falsely claimed she had missed multiple months. This wasn't just a mistake. This was fraud. A slow, determined fire burned in Maria's chest. She had them. Before she could process her next move, a voice cut through the room. "All rise. Court is now in session." Maria's pulse quickened. It was time. She stepped inside the courtroom, gripping her evidence tightly, ready to defend herself. As she approached the defendant's table, she caught the eye of Judge Leonard Sterling. He barely glanced at her, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips, as if this was all just a waste of his time. Maria took a deep breath, steadying herself. They thought she was just a janitor, a nobody who didn't belong here. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Maria stood at the defendant's table, gripping the edges like an anchor, as Judge Leonard Sterling settled into his chair. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as attorneys shuffled papers and whispered among themselves. To them, she was just another lost case, another eviction they'd seen 100 times before. Across the aisle, Daniel Briggs adjusted his tie, smirking. He was already celebrating, convinced this was nothing more than a formality. To him, Maria wasn't a threat. She was just a janitor grasping at straws, and in a few minutes, she'd be out of her home for good. "Let's get this over with," Judge Sterling said, flipping through the case file without interest. "Ms. Castillo, I assume you don't have legal representation?" Maria ignored the condescension. "I'll be representing myself." Briggs let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Of course." The judge raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Very well, Mr. Briggs, you may proceed." Briggs stood, radiating arrogance. "Your Honor, this is a clear-cut case. The defendant has repeatedly failed to meet mortgage payments, and the bank was forced to proceed with foreclosure. Holloway Holdings has legally acquired the property, and frankly, we're only here as a courtesy before executing the eviction." He turned to Maria, smirk widening. "I'd advise Ms. Castillo to start packing." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Maria's fingers tightened into fists, but she stayed calm, controlled. They expected her to lash out, to crumble. Instead, she lifted her chin and spoke. "I object to that characterization," she said, her voice sharp, deliberate. "There is nothing clear-cut about this case." Judge Sterling sighed. "Ms. Castillo, unless you have a legal argument—" "I do," Maria interrupted. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of documents, walking to the judge's bench and sliding them across. "According to these, I've made every mortgage payment on time, yet somehow my home was foreclosed anyway. Would you care to explain that?" Briggs's smirk faltered. The judge glanced at the papers, frowning. He skimmed through them, his expression shifting slightly. Annoyance flickered in his eyes. Briggs recovered quickly, stepping forward. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the defendant is not an attorney. She doesn't understand the intricacies of foreclosure law." Maria turned her gaze on him, cool, unwavering. "Actually," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a knife, "I do." Silence fell. Maria stepped forward, locking eyes with Briggs. "I graduated from Columbia Law School. I passed the bar. I practiced law for years. I know exactly how foreclosure works. And I know when documents have been falsified." Gasps rippled through the room. Even Judge Sterling looked momentarily stunned. Briggs' face paled. His confidence wavered just for a second. Maria took a step closer, dropping her voice just enough for everyone to hear. "You should have done your research." Briggs's smirk vanished, his jaw tightening as Maria's words hung in the air. The courtroom, once filled with quiet amusement at her expense, now shifted. The murmurs grew louder. The judge adjusted his glasses, peering at Maria as if seeing For the first time, you're a lawyer? Judge Sterling asked, skepticism laced in his tone. Maria met his gaze without hesitation. I was, until I left the profession. Briggs recovered quickly, forcing out a chuckle. Your Honor, whether or not Ms. Castillo once practiced law is irrelevant. The fact remains, Maria interrupted, that my home was foreclosed under fraudulent circumstances, and you, she turned to Briggs, stepping closer, helped make it happen. A ripple of tension ran through the room. Briggs straightened, glaring at her. That's an outrageous accusation. She turned back to the judge and pointed at the stack of documents she had submitted. If you look at the payment records, you'll see that the bank falsely reported missing payments on my mortgage. But if you compare those to my bank statements, you'll see that every payment was made on time. The judge flipped through the pages, his frown deepening. Briggs shifted uncomfortably, clearly hoping this would blow over. Maria wasn't done. That's not all, she continued, voice unwavering. Page 5 of my foreclosure documents contains my signature. But I never signed those papers. She pulled another page from her file and held it up. This is my actual signature. They don't match. Judge Sterling's lips pressed into a thin line as he studied the two documents. Even a layman could see the difference. Forgery, he muttered under his breath. Briggs cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. This is ridiculous. She's grasping at straws. She doesn't have the expertise to— I do, Maria cut in sharply, and so do forensic analysts. I can request a handwriting expert to confirm what's already obvious. Briggs opened his mouth, then closed it. Maria could see the gears turning in his head. He had walked into this courtroom expecting a quick, easy victory, but now the balance was shifting. Maria turned to the judge, her voice steady but firm. Your Honor, at the very least, this warrants an injunction against my eviction while an investigation is conducted. If the foreclosure was obtained through fraudulent means, then Holloway Holdings has no legal claim to my home. The judge exhaled, drumming his fingers against his bench. He glanced at Briggs. Mr. Briggs, do you have an immediate counter to these claims? Briggs hesitated. A fraction of a second too long. Maria's heart pounded. She had him. Judge Sterling sighed and leaned back in his chair. Given the severity of these accusations, I'll grant a temporary stay on the eviction. We'll reconvene in a week. Maria clenched her fists, holding back her triumph. Round one was hers. Maria walked out of the courtroom, her pulse still pounding in her ears. The moment she stepped into the hallway, a hand grabbed her arm. She turned sharply, only to see Daniel. Briggs, his smirk gone, his face tight with barely restrained anger. What the hell do you think you're doing? He hissed. Maria yanked her arm free, meeting his glare without flinching, exposing the fraud you helped orchestrate. Briggs let out a low chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. You think you won something in there? A 1-week delay. That's nothing. Holloway has money, connections. You're just a washed-up lawyer playing detective. He stepped closer, voice dropping. Walk away now, and maybe I can make things easier for you. Maria's lips curled into a smirk of her own. That sounds like a bribe, counselor. Briggs' eyes darkened. It's a warning. Maria didn't respond. She turned and walked away, her heart hammering. She knew exactly what this was. Fear. Briggs and Holloway had gotten away with stealing homes for years, and now someone was finally standing up to them. But she wasn't naive. This wasn't over. If anything, things were about to get much, much worse. By the time Maria got home, exhaustion weighed on her, but she didn't let herself rest. She sat at her small dining table, stacks of documents spread in front of her. The fake foreclosure papers, her bank statements, the signature discrepancies, it was all there, plain as day. But in court, evidence wasn't enough. She needed proof that couldn't be ignored. She pulled out her phone and dialed the only person. She knew who could help her now. It rang twice before a voice answered. Didn't think I'd hear from you again. Maria sighed. Ava, I need your help. Ava Brooks had been one of the best investigative journalists in the city before she walked away from big newsrooms to run an independent blog. She hated corruption as much as Maria did, and she knew how to dig up dirt. Tell me everything, Ava said. Maria spent the next 15 minutes laying it all out. The fake foreclosure, the forged signatures, the judge's reaction, Briggs' veiled threat. By the time she finished, Ava was already clicking away on her keyboard. "Yeah, this stinks," Ava muttered. "Holloway's name has popped up in shady land deals before, but nothing ever sticks. If we can find a pattern of fraud, your case won't just save your house, it could bring his entire operation down." Maria exhaled, rubbing her temples. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you've got, and time." Ava paused. "But Maria, be careful. If Holloway thinks you're a real threat, he won't just fight you in court." Maria closed her eyes for a second, pushing down the weight of exhaustion. "I know," she said. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was bringing them down. Maria barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Briggs's smirk, Holloway's arrogance, the desperate homeowner grasping at straws. They were wrong. By sunrise, she was back at the courthouse. If she was going to win this case, she needed to be prepared for every angle of attack. She wasn't just fighting to keep her home. She was fighting to expose the fraud Holloway had built his empire on. She spent the morning pulling case records, foreclosure histories, and legal precedents. She dug into past lawsuits against Holloway Holdings, searching for patterns, for anything that could connect her case to a larger scheme. Then she found it. A dozen other cases, all eerily similar to hers. Homeowners mysteriously losing their properties despite having proof of payment. The same forged signatures, the same bank involvement. Some had fought back, but none had won, because they didn't have the legal expertise Maria had. Her phone buzzed. "Ava, I found something," Ava said the second Maria answered. "An off-the-record source from the bank. He says some of Holloway's deals were pushed through with missing or altered paperwork." Maria gripped the phone tighter. "Is he willing to testify?" Ava sighed. "Not yet. He's scared. If we want him, we need more leverage." Maria nodded, already forming a plan. "Then we get it." She hung up and took a deep breath. The walls around Holloway and Briggs were starting to crack. Now she needed to break them wide open. By noon, she was back at her house, poring over more documents, when there was a loud knock at the door. Her body tensed. It was too early for another court notice. She opened the door to find a man in an expensive suit standing on her porch. Not Briggs. Someone worse. Richard Holloway. He smiled, casual, like they were old friends. "Maria, can we talk?" She folded her arms. "No." His smile didn't falter. "Come on, I think we got off on the wrong foot." He gestured toward the street where a black luxury car idled, engine humming. "Let's go for a drive, just a conversation." Maria's stomach twisted. A conversation. Holloway wasn't here to negotiate, he was here to warn her off. She didn't flinch. "Whatever you have to say, say it here." Holloway studied her, the smile finally fading. "Fine, I'll make this simple." His voice dropped to something colder. "You're making a mistake. I don't lose cases, and I don't like obstacles." Maria didn't blink. "Then you're going to hate me." Holloway exhaled, shaking his head. "I was hoping we could avoid this." He took a step closer. "Last chance, Maria, walk away." Maria lifted her chin. "See you in court." Holloway's eyes darkened. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. As he drove away, Maria knew one thing. This was war. Maria locked the door behind her and exhaled slowly. Her hands were steady, but her heart was hammering. Holloway wasn't bluffing. He had come to make her afraid, to push her into giving up. But he had underestimated her. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. Maria grabbed her phone and dialed Ava. The moment she answered, Maria didn't waste time. "Holloway just paid me a visit." Ava cursed under her breath. "What did he say?" "Exactly what you'd expect. Threats disguised as friendly warnings." Maria rubbed her temples, frustration building. "He thinks he can scare me off." Ava was silent for a moment. "Maria, this isn't just a legal battle anymore. If Holloway is getting personally involved, he sees you as a problem." "Good," Maria said. "That means I'm getting close." Ava sighed. "I pulled more records. There are at least 20 homeowners who had their properties taken under suspicious circumstances, all linked to Holloway Holdings." Maria's grip tightened on the phone. 20. Holloway had been running this scheme for years, stealing homes from people who didn't have the resources to fight back. People like Maria. "We need a smoking gun," Maria said. Something undeniable. Ava hesitated. I have a lead. Maria straightened. Tell me. There's an ex-banker who used to process foreclosures. He claims he was ordered to lose certain homeowners' payment records. Ava's tone darkened. He might be willing to talk. Off the record. Maria didn't hesitate. Where is he? Later that night, Maria pulled into a rundown diner on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered, barely staying lit. Inside, the booths were mostly empty, save for a lone man hunched over a cup of coffee. Maria slid into the booth across from him. He was in his early 40s, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He barely looked at her. Ava sent you? His voice was rough, weary. Maria nodded. She said you had information. The man exhaled, fingers tapping against the ceramic cup. I worked for the bank handling Holloway's foreclosures. I started noticing payments disappearing from the system. Homeowners would swear they paid, but the records would show otherwise. He swallowed hard. I was told not to ask questions. Maria leaned in. Told by who? The man hesitated, then shook his head. Maria's voice was steady, firm. People are losing their homes. You can stop this. He ran a hand down his face. Look, Holloway has people everywhere. If I go on record, I'm a dead man. Maria studied him. Fear radiated from him, but so did guilt. Then let me use what you know, she said softly. Anonymous testimony, paper trails. Give me something I can take to court. The man hesitated for a long moment. Then, finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. This has everything, he said. Payment records, internal emails, proof of forged signatures. He pushed it across the table. You didn't get this from me. Maria took it, her pulse pounding. This was it, the evidence she needed, and Holloway had no idea what was coming. Maria gripped the flash drive tightly as she left the diner, her mind racing. This was the proof she had been searching for, the evidence that could expose Holloway's entire operation. But she also knew what this meant. Holloway wouldn't go down without a fight. She slid into her car, heart pounding, and immediately, called Ava. I got it, she said the moment Ava answered. The flash drive? Ava's voice sharpened. It's filled with internal emails, deleted payment records, everything. Maria took a shaky breath. If this gets in front of a judge, Holloway is finished. Ava let out a low whistle. That's great, but Maria, be careful. You don't think Holloway is going to let this slide, do you? Maria already knew the answer. She had seen the look in his eyes when he told her to walk away. He had expected her to fold, to take her eviction and disappear, quietly like so many before her. Instead, she was bringing the fight to him. I'm sending you a copy, Maria said. If anything happens to me, make sure this gets out. Ava's tone turned serious. Nothing is going to happen to you. Maria wished she could be that confident. She pulled out of the parking lot, constantly checking her mirrors, half expecting a black SUV to pull up behind her. She wasn't being paranoid. Holloway had money, influence, and power. She was just one woman standing against a system designed to crush people like her. But she wasn't backing down. By the time she got home, exhaustion clung to her body, but she refused to sleep. She plugged the flash drive into her laptop and started combing through the files. Everything was there. Emails between Holloway and bank executives detailing how they manipulated payment histories to trigger fraudulent foreclosures. Internal memos instructing employees to ignore homeowners' complaints. Even documentation of bribes paid to certain judges. Maria's stomach turned. This wasn't just one case. This was a system-wide conspiracy. Her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She hesitated before answering. A low, measured voice spoke on the other end. You're making a mistake, Maria. She froze. Who is this? You already know, Holloway. You should have taken my offer, he continued. I was willing to be generous, but now you've forced my hand. Maria's grip on the phone tightened. You can threaten me all you want. It won't change the fact that I have proof, and I'm taking it to court. Holloway chuckled, cold and calculated. You think a few documents will stop me? Pause. You won't even make it to court. The line went dead. Maria's breath came in short bursts, adrenaline flooding her veins. Holloway wasn't just trying to scare her anymore. This was a warning, and she knew one thing for certain. She had to strike first. Maria sat in the dim glow of her laptop screen, her pulse still racing from Holloway's call. He wanted her scared, shaken. He wanted her to feel powerless. But he had just made his biggest mistake. He confirmed she was a threat. She wasn't waiting for him to come after her. She was going on the offensive. She picked up her phone and called Ava. "We're taking this public." Ava hesitated. "You sure? Once this goes out, there's no turning back." Maria's jaw tightened. "He just threatened me. He thinks I'll back down. We need to make sure this information gets out before he can bury it." Ava exhaled. "All right, send me everything. I'll start drafting the story." Maria nodded, transferring the files to Ava while making extra copies for herself. She wasn't just fighting for her home anymore. She was blowing the entire scheme wide open. She had one more call to make. It rang twice before Judge Sterling's weary voice answered. "Ms. Castillo, it's late." Maria didn't waste time. "Your Honor, I have new evidence. It proves that Holloway's foreclosures are fraudulent, and it directly implicates Briggs." A long silence. "Then, you better come to my chambers. First thing in the morning." Maria closed her laptop, exhaling. She should have felt relief. Instead, the weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her. She was going up against a machine built on corruption, money, and power. Holloway wouldn't just accept defeat. He would fight. Maria walked into the courthouse with a folder clutched tightly in her hands. Her every step felt deliberate, her heart pounding, but her resolve was stronger than ever. Judge Sterling's chambers were quiet when she entered. He sat behind his desk, studying her with a calculating gaze. "Show me." Maria placed the folder in front of him, opening it to the most damning pages. These emails detail how Holloway manipulated banks into falsifying missed payments. These internal memos prove that Briggs knowingly submitted forged documents in court. Sterling flipped through the pages, his expression darkening. He looked up at her, eyes sharp. "This is serious." Maria's voice was steady. Sterling let out a slow breath. "I'll review this, but you need to be careful. If this gets out too soon..." "It's already out," Maria interrupted. "Ava is publishing the story." The judge's brows lifted slightly, but he nodded. "Then we need to move fast." Before Maria could respond, the door to Sterling's chambers burst open. Briggs stormed in, his face flushed with barely contained rage. "Judge, this woman is fabricating evidence." Maria turned to him, calm and unwavering. "You seem nervous, Briggs." Briggs' hands clenched into fists. "You don't know what you're doing." Maria took a step forward, meeting his glare. "No," she said, voice firm. "You don't." Maria stood her ground as Briggs seethed, his face reddening. Judge Sterling flipped through the pages again, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. Briggs slammed his hand on the desk. "This is an ambush, a stunt." His voice was sharp, but there was an undeniable tremor in it. Maria folded her arms. "You're welcome to refute the evidence." Briggs glared at her, nostrils flaring. "This is inadmissible." "It's more than admissible," Sterling interrupted, his tone steely. "If what Ms. Castillo is presenting holds up, this is a criminal matter." He closed the folder and looked directly at Briggs. "Are you denying the authenticity of these documents?" Briggs's mouth opened, then snapped shut. His hands clenched at his sides, his mind clearly racing for an escape. Maria pressed forward. "If you want to challenge my credibility, let's take it to court. I'd love to have a forensic team analyze every signature on those foreclosure documents." Briggs's eye twitched. He was trapped, and he knew it. Sterling sighed, rubbing his temples. "I need to deliberate on this. Court reconvenes tomorrow." He looked at Maria. "Ms. Castillo, keep your head down. Things are about to get messy." Maria knew what that meant. Holloway wouldn't take this lying down. She exited the chambers, her pulse steady, but her senses on high alert. She had been expecting retaliation from Holloway, but now it was imminent. That night, Maria double-checked her locks and closed every curtain in her house. She felt the paranoia creeping in, but she had to stay sharp. She had done everything right, gathered every shred of evidence, backed it up in multiple places, but Holloway had more than money. He had people. Just past midnight, a noise outside made her freeze. A car idling, Maria's breath hitched. Slowly, she moved to the window, careful not to disturb the curtain. A black sedan sat across the street, its engine humming low, her stomach clenched. She reached for her phone and dialed Ava. A groggy voice answered. "Maria, there's a car outside," Maria whispered, her fingers tightening around the phone. "It's just sitting there." Ava was awake in an instant. "Call the police." Maria hesitated. Would they even help her? Holloway had people everywhere. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the car pulled away, tires rolling slow over the pavement. Maria let out a shaky breath. "Maria?" Ava's voice was urgent. "They're just trying to scare me," Maria muttered. It won't work, but deep down, she knew this was more than intimidation. Holloway had sent a message. He wasn't done. Maria barely slept. Every creak in the house, every distant car passing by, sent her nerves on edge. Holloway wasn't just trying to scare her. He wanted her to back down before court reconvened. But fear wasn't going to stop her. It never had before. By morning, she was ready. She dressed carefully, making sure every document was accounted for, backing up everything one more time. Ava had already arranged for the article to go live right after court, ensuring Holloway couldn't suppress it. As she stepped outside, she immediately noticed the black sedan parked a block away, the same one from last night. She refused to acknowledge. They wanted her to panic. They wanted her to slip up. Not happening. At the courthouse, the atmosphere was different. Reporters lingered outside, murmuring amongst themselves. Somehow, word had already spread. Holloway's name was being whispered. Questions being asked. Maria stepped into the courtroom, heart steady, and the room quieted. He adjusted his glasses, looking between Maria and Briggs. "Let's get to it." Briggs stood first. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by forced control. "Your Honor, these accusations are baseless. The so-called evidence was acquired under questionable circumstances." Maria rose from her seat. "Your Honor, I move to introduce new forensic analysis into evidence." She walked to the bench, sliding another folder forward. Independent experts confirmed that at least 10 foreclosure documents contain forged homeowner signatures. Briggs' jaw clenched. Maria continued, unshaken. "We also have internal emails confirming the deletion of payment records, ensuring homeowners appeared to be in default when they weren't." Judge Sterling flipped through the files, his lips pressed into a thin line. He saw it now. "This is serious," he muttered before looking up. "Mr. Briggs, does your client have a response?" Briggs exhaled sharply. "My client is a respected businessman," Maria cut in. "Your client is a criminal, Your Honor." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Briggs snapped, "You can't." Maria turned to him, her voice clear, unwavering. "We can analyze every single foreclosure under Holloway's name. You really want to see how deep this fraud goes?" Briggs paled. Judge Sterling leaned back, nodding slowly. He turned to Briggs. "Given the weight of this evidence, I'm issuing a full injunction on the eviction." Maria's stomach flipped. "And I'm ordering a criminal investigation into Holloway Holdings." Briggs' face drained of color. It was over. Maria sat down, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She had done it. But as she glanced toward the back of the courtroom, she saw Richard Holloway standing there, staring at her, expression unreadable. He didn't look angry. He didn't look defeated. He just smiled. Maria's victory should have felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. But that smile, Holloway's slow, knowing smirk from the back of the courtroom, sent a chill through her. He wasn't afraid. Even with the judge's ruling, even with the looming criminal investigation, he still thought he had control. She gripped the edges of the table, forcing herself to stay calm. Holloway thrived on intimidation, on power plays. He wanted her to feel like this wasn't over, but it was. It had to be. Judge Sterling's gavel slammed down. "Court is adjourned." The sound echoed through the room, final and sharp. The courtroom burst into murmurs as reporters scrambled to file their stories. Maria pushed herself up from her seat, steady, composed. Briggs stormed past her without a word, his career effectively ruined. Holloway, however, took his time. As he walked down the aisle toward the exit, he turned his head just enough to look at her. "This isn't over," he murmured. Maria met his gaze without hesitation. "For you, it is?" Holloway chuckled softly before stepping through the doors, disappearing into the sea of cameras and reporters waiting outside. Maria exhaled, her hands finally unclenching. Ava appeared beside her, eyes wide with excitement. "You did it," she said. "The story's already spreading like wildfire." Maria nodded, exhaustion washing over her now that the adrenaline had faded. "It's not just about me anymore," she said, voice softer. "There are other families, other homes they stole." Ava gave her a knowing look. "So what's next?" Maria glanced back at the judge's bench, at the place where she had reclaimed not just her home, but her voice. The place where she had proven that the system could be beaten. "I fight," she said simply. A week later, Maria stood on the front steps of her house, breathing in the familiar scent of warm pavement and cut grass. Her home. The eviction was officially reversed. Holloway Holdings was facing multiple lawsuits, and federal investigators had already started digging into the bank's fraudulent activities. But Maria wasn't finished. She glanced at the papers in her hand, her law license renewal application. For years, she had run from the legal world, burying herself in quiet, invisible work, thinking she had nothing left to give. But this fight had reminded her of who she really was: a fighter, an advocate. She looked up as a car pulled into her driveway. A woman stepped out, one of the homeowners Holloway had tried to evict. Tears filled her eyes as she reached for Maria's. "Hands! Because of you, I still have my home," the woman whispered. Maria squeezed her fingers gently. "Then let's make sure no one else loses theirs." She turned, walking back toward the courthouse, not to clean it, to fight in it.